Okay. So I'm going to talk about an exhibition. Can you hear me? I'm going to talk about an exhibition that I made some time ago, 7 years ago. So it's been a little bit of a exercise to get my head back into it sufficiently. It's always there, but yes, yeah. I can't really hear this ear at the moment. So is that better? That's better, isn't it? Okay, so I'm going to talk about this exhibition that I did 7 years ago in 2010 at Tate Liverpool, and which then travelled to Spain, to Santiago de Compostela. This is the catalogue. You're welcome to come and have a look at it afterwards. It's the only copy I have, unfortunately. But if you'd like to look at it, then do come and... Yes, there was, as a result of this project, a website constructed called the Black Atlantic Resource, and many of the texts are actually online and continue to be, added to as well with new research at the University of Liverpool. So that was an ongoing part of the project. So I've asked for the images to be rotated. I have many images, so if I explain each one, it's going to take far too long. So I'll just, in general, talk about the exhibition, and why it happened, the framing of it, and then kind of some of the themes around it. It's an exhibition which did address the Caribbean, but placed that in a much wider thematic framework. It was an exhibition that came about as part of a self-critical reflection on the work of the institution. By this time I had been at the Tate for more than a decade, and thought very much about the absences in the collection and in the exhibition program. And it came out of my work on two other exhibitions which addressed the kind of limitations of a story of modernism that the institution was telling. One was an exhibition called Making History, Art and Documentary in Britain from 1929 to now, and looked at how documentary had been excluded from a sort of central canonical history of modernism within the institution, and addressed as something other than the proper kind of modernism. And the other was an exhibition that I had just curated with Ellen Gallagher at Tate Liverpool called Coral Cities. And so I embarked on this exhibition in the wake of those other two exhibitions, but also as a result of, I guess, my framing as a curator, but also as an art historian, formed in the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, at a moment when identity politics was really a chief concern, and yet had not really been absorbed by or paid attention to by the institution in which I worked. And so in 2010, I thought, let's take a look back at that moment via a particular text, and the text I decided to look at this history of modernism via was Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, and to read visual modernism through this book, and also to reflect back on that early 1990s moment. So this book had been published in 1993 and had caused a huge amount of controversy. And it really addressed both a culture of a broad Atlantic that Gilroy framed as a continent in negative, but through mostly literature and music. And I thought, well, there's something to be said here about visual culture and visual modernism through the lens of this very complicated but very interesting book. And one of the other major reference, and why the Caribbean featured very centrally in my thinking was the work of Edward Glissant, and I know he's been mentioned a little bit. There's many references in this show that have already come up in people's presentations. But those were the sorts of things that I was thinking about, and particularly paying attention to organisations, the work of organisations such as INNOVA, the Institute of International Visual Arts in London, whose various projects had had a really profound influence on my work and thinking as a curator and art historian, particularly the exhibition Rhapsodies in Black that happened at the Hayward Gallery in 1996, a series of books edited by Corbina Mercer from 2005 to 2008, including Cosmopolitan Modernisms and Discrepant Abstraction, which were really key in my thinking at this time. And also another book which related to histories of Latin American art, which had been one of my other hats at the Tate, which was Beyond the Fantastic, and particularly essays in that book by Nestor Garcia Canclini and particularly Andrea Junta. So these kinds of things were in the background of my thinking, and also thinking through the practice of particular artists like Ellen Gallagher, who I'd worked with, or Isaac Julian, who I'd worked with on a number of occasions, and Chris Ofili. And it was thinking through their kind of, the lens of their eyes, the art history that their work talked about, that I wanted to create an exhibition at the Tate around. I'm going to read a little bit from some of the texts that I wrote at the time, and then make a few reflections on that as well. So Edward Glissant wrote, "Whenever a fleet of ships gave chase to slave ships, it was easiest just to lighten the boat by throwing cargo overboard, weighing it down with balls and chains. Navigating the green splendor of the sea still brings to mind, coming to light like seaweed, these lowest depths, these deeps, with their punctuation of scarcely corroded balls. The entire ocean, the entire sea, gently collapsing, in the end, into the pleasures of sand, making one vast beginning, but a beginning whose time is marked by these balls and chains gone green." And another quote, Homi Bhabha wrote, "Our existence today is marked by a tenebrious sense of survival, living on the borderlines of the present, for which there seems to be no proper name other than the current and controversial shiftiness of the prefix post, postmodernism, post-colonialism, post-feminism." So I wrote at the time, to Homi Bhabha's list of terms carrying the prefix post, we can now add post-black, indicating the continuing shiftiness of meaning and ongoing attempts to define new registers of cultural expression that supersede those of yesterday. Robert Farris Thompson first proposed post-black as a term that aimed to expose the restrictions of postmodernity in a 1991 essay titled Afro-Modernism, in which he suggested, quote, "a retelling of modernism to show how it predicts that the triumph of the current sequences would reveal that the other is your neighbor, that black and modernist cultures were inseparable long ago," which in itself, end quote, which in itself echoes Frank Bowling's even earlier assertion that, quote, "the black soul, if there can be such a thing, belongs in modernism," end quote. Both authors highlight a problem that concerns a much broader field within visual modernism, and one taken up by Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, and that is that there are different spaces and temporalities at work throughout the Atlantic realm that produce new periodizations of the modern and postmodern, as well as new formulations of modernism in art. So this exhibition, and I think why it's interesting in relation to this panel, aimed to address the shifting spaces, temporalities, and formulations of modernism as it related to black cultures and the black diaspora through the last century. And it took a broadly chronological framework from roughly 1907 to 2010. And it was concerned with the changing politics impacting on artistic expression at key instances when dominant or hegemonic modes of modernism can be seen to be challenged by alternative visions. In this sense, the exhibition was indebted to a great deal of work as I have mentioned, done previously in defining a multiplicity of modernisms rather than one single core narrative. In terms of the kind of temporal framing that Paul Gilroy gives us, his idea of Black Atlantic is that it describes a counterculture to European modernity and modernism, to the project of Enlightenment and its concomitant rationalism, historical progress, and scientific reason. His thesis argued against essentialist versions of racial identity and racial nationalisms in favor of a shared, though heterogeneous, culture that joined diverse communities in North and South America, the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. And that was the sort of challenge I took on with the exhibition, was to try and address this entire field of operation, which is slightly crazy, I guess. So Gilroy proposed that the Atlantic be treated as quote, one single complex unit of analysis, which could produce an explicitly transnational and intercultural perspective, end quote. This perspective recognized the value of specific and divergent local or regional developments within culture, while relating them to a metaculture, described by Gilroy as a network or rhizome. And I think in that sense, he's also very influenced by Glisson. In such an analysis, what becomes important are the real and metaphorical journeys, both enforced and voluntary, that constitute this network across the Atlantic. Within it, the slave journeys of the Middle Passage take on a preeminent and foundational position. They are the origin of the racial terror and dislocation shared by Black communities throughout the Atlantic, but are also the root of a productive syncretism that Gilroy aims to wrest from what has otherwise been cast as wholly negative, perpetuating a limiting sense of victimhood, cultural exclusion, and inferiority. So this was one of the points about the book that made it so controversial at the time, that it was trying to argue for a productivity of the cultures that came about as a result of horrific history of violence. Gilroy argued that a number of different moments of connectedness might emerge from this network that overall built up a complex picture of cultural exchange and continuity. It does not impose an all-encompassing and totalizing homogeneity on what he calls Black Atlantic expressive culture, but rather proposed a subtle analysis that, instead of foregrounding difference, takes into account aspects of sameness that nevertheless surface in diverse and complex way and in different contexts as, quote, the changing same, end quote. Gilroy's text aimed to highlight both the paradoxes and overlooked narratives of modernity and to argue that racialized reason, terror, and slavery were internal to the project of modernity. So it's not an alternative narrative, it is part of the narrative. One of the central themes that Gilroy delineates is that of double consciousness. Drawn from the writings of W.B. Du Bois, this concept described the split subjectivity and race consciousness that Du Bois observes as inherent to the experience of being an African American, an awareness of existing simultaneously both within and outside the dominant culture. This double consciousness, Gilroy argues, is one of the defining characteristics of Black Atlantic expressive culture. My interest in this was the fact that in this sense, Gilroy's concept of a Black Atlantic had important implications for the study of art. His book prefigured many of the debates around the transnational, the intercultural, and globalization that have taken place since it was published. And, as I've said, it can also be related to other prior conceptual framings of these issues, such as Glisson's notion of Antillanité, or Caribbeanness, though this latter presents both a case for a more specifically regional convergence of a greater multiplicity of cultures highlighting difference and an emphasis on mutability in which fragmentation, adaptation, and synchronicity all play a part in the dynamics of relation. Glisson's table of the diaspora, which you will have seen in one of the slides, maps complex, nonlinear, and somewhat chaotic associations within a network of encompassing continental America, the Caribbean, and Africa. This diagram manifests Glisson's sense of the formlessness of cross-cultural relation, or the true quote, the true shapelessness of historical diversity, end quote, around the Atlantic, and thus the complexity of its cultural and aesthetic effects. So the exhibition took the form of 7 sections, thematically, a roughly chronological framework, looking first of all at what I call Black Atlantic avant-gardes, bringing the work of artists such as Picasso and Modigliani, Léger, who was an important teacher of many of these personalities, into juxtaposition with other avant-gardes, such as Brazilian anthropophagia, which was talked about yesterday. And then later sections dealt with the work of Maya Deren in Haiti, also a section on negritude, which looked at Wilfredo Lam as another instance of an alternative strategy for addressing modernism from a different cultural perspective. And then also brought that into juxtaposition with Nigerian natural synthesis, which happened in the mid-century. And then the later part of the exhibition was divided into 4 sections, which looked at thematically different moments of production, of work, a kind of dissident and politicized practice of the late 1950s, 60s and 70s, and then more contemporary eras, and particularly a section around the notion of reconstructing histories, which was where Chris's work was featured. So my presentation also has a Chris Cozier element to it as well. And it was interesting to me that Claire yesterday talked about this idea from Bakhtin of the chronotope, because that was crucial in this section around reconstructing the Middle Passage, around diaspora memory, and the creative use of and reconstruction of history, the poetic reconstruction of history, because this is an image and a concept that Gilroy uses, and he structures this around the idea of the slave ship. So he calls the ship a chronotope, which is this spatial temporal unit that then articulates the Black Atlantic and the connections between the different points on this network of relation. And I think I should end on this quote from Gilroy, and he says, "I have settled on the image of ships in motion across the space between Europe, America, Africa, and the Caribbean as a central organizing symbol for this enterprise and as my starting point. The image of the ship, a living microcultural, micropolitical system in motion, is especially important for historical and theoretical reasons. Ships immediately focus attention on the Middle Passage, on the various projects for redemptive return to an African homeland, on the circulation of ideas and activists, as well as the movement of key cultural and political artifacts, tracts, books, gramophone records, and choirs." So this kind of ship unit really formed a kind of a heart of the thinking around this idea of what Gilroy talks about as a polyphony, the polyphony that underpins this idea of a Black Atlantic expressive culture through contact, through movement, but also questioning and enabling us to question the different kinds of temporalities put in place by these different contacts and surfacings of the changing same. I think I should probably stop there.